Welcome into another episode of Fielding the 68 here on the final day of January in 2025. We have an opportunity to reveal the entire 68-team bracket here on the field of 68. Paul Fritschner, alongside the experts Rocco Miller and Brad Wachtel. This is going to be a fun afternoon, fellas, because we are going through each region and listing off all 68 teams. We will have plenty of bubble talk at the end. But just as you will see on Selection Sunday, our graphics department got in the lab and they cooked up everything that you're going to want to see here over the next hour for your favorite team, where they're going to slot in, and what they maybe need to do to improve their seed line come Selection Sunday. As always, Fielding the 68 is presented by Rhythm, and we're not going to waste any time here. We're going to get right into it. We're going to go right to the first region, and let's see it. Let's reveal the bracket. Let's get right to the top of the show here. And in that South region, we have Auburn as the number one overall seed. American and Morehead State there as the auto bids out of their respective conferences. And then in the 8-9 game, a pretty intriguing one. We'll get thoughts on all of this. Creighton and West Virginia, a West Virginia team that has slid a little bit here lately, lost 3 in a row, and Creighton a win over Xavier the other night. They've kind of gotten themselves out of that 10-seed region a little more firmly in the field. Rocco, we'll start with you. Auburn, the number one overall seed here to start off the night.
Paul, this is so exciting. I love how you just jumped right in, like, RIP to the late, great Greg Gumbel. But it's always the best selection show. We just jump right into the bracket, and here we are. 5 teams announced. I have 0 disagreements. We're 5 for 5. I love it. Auburn, of course, the clear number one, with 10 wins against the field, 12-1 in quadrant 1, 13-1, 15-1. They're just an unstoppable force from a resume standpoint. And of course, depending on your favorite performance metric, they're in the top 3 at least. So Auburn, just so many good pieces of gold and silver. They're the clear number one. And then what an interesting first round game if Morehead State beats American. Janai Broom's team from he played his freshman and sophomore year. The Morehead community loves him. That would be a really cool story for a 1-16 matchup. And then moving on to the 8-9, another amazing story. And again, this is a great segue for what we'll see throughout the night, Paul and Brad, is the bracket process confines us to a lot of very specific steps that we don't try to fix. There's really no way you could fix it. And this is the beauty of it. You get Darian DeVries, the head coach at West Virginia, a 20-year assistant of Greg McDermott at Creighton, playing each other in the first round. These stories write themselves. I think more importantly, West Virginia slipping to a 9 might be more alarming to the Mountaineer community there. And I would say to you, there's so much good that West Virginia has done that they're okay for now. But this is really the danger zone. There's a lot of quality emerging teams like Maryland and UCLA and Missouri that have jumped West Virginia just due to the quality. But you can't take away the road win at Kansas, and you can't take away those wins over Arizona and Gonzaga. So West Virginia is okay for now, but they're just 7-7 in meaningful games, and they might take on too much water if this continues. So a definite warning sign overall for the Mountaineers.
Brad, any thoughts there on the top of the South region?
I think the way it's set up right now, those are the seeds I have for every single one of those teams, just like Rocco. I think Creighton right now is in a much safer position than West Virginia. West Virginia has the top tier wins, which is keeping them in the field. But like Rocco mentioned, like you're playing in the Big 12, they're not a lock. So they're going to have a relatively tough schedule the rest of the way. And if you start piling up losses, they're going to be in trouble. They're going to slip right towards the bubble if that continues. That's going to be a resume to watch as we go along. They just need quantity. They don't need quality wins. That's all they need. But I like the way this matchup is and the seeds they have where you have it set up right now.
All right, let's keep moving down the South region. We'll take a look at the next pod here. And in the 4-13 game, you have Oregon and Utah Valley. Oregon coming off that loss last night, a blowout loss at Pauley Pavilion to UCLA. And then Memphis winning at Tulane last night for the first time in 5 years, playing a Will Wade McNeese team in a very intriguing 5-12 game. Brad, I'll start with you here on this pod. Any thoughts on Oregon and Memphis here in that 4-5 spot?
I think those teams are seeded perfectly. Oregon is a team that's had an interesting season. I mean, they've gotten off to the one of the best starts of any team in the country with their play in Vegas early on. But once they reached Big Ten play for the first time, they kind of fell back down to earth. They were all the way up to a number 2 seed, even on the border of a number 1 seed towards the beginning of the season. So it's going to be, we'll have to see how this team finishes up play. But I'm getting a little bit concerned, and you have to wonder, was the beginning of the season, is that the true Oregon, or is how they've played the last few weeks what they really are? So that's something to pay attention to the rest of the way. But right now, I think they're well seeded. They're 8-2 against Q1 opponents, 3-2 against high Q1A opponents, and 9-4 against Q1-2 opponents. And they're 8-1, actually 8-2 away from home now that they've just lost to UCLA last night. But their metrics, when you take a look at their metrics for Oregon, result-based metrics, their strength of record, their KPI, their wins above bubble, they're all top 15, which still puts them in good position for a seed. The negatives of that resume are their predictive metrics, which hover around 30 at the moment. So there is definitely room for them to slip if they don't continue to get some quality wins in Big Ten play. But I think that Memphis-McNeese matchup will be a tough matchup for Memphis, and I'm sure Rocco can add on a little bit more to that matchup as well.
Love to. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a shame to see them play each other just based on the fact that McNeese is clearly one of the strongest and dangerous teams from the mid-major level. Quite honestly, a Power 5 level starting 5 and probably first 7 of that rotation for the Cowboys, completely dominating the Southland so far as they did last year. And Memphis, the sad news for the American, the only representative from the American. So one of them would have quickly. But I think the opportunity for one of them to get to Atlanta would be really good right now based on the way Oregon's been stumbling, as Brad mentioned. I do agree that Oregon belongs as a protected seed. The NCAA treats those top 4 seeds a little bit differently than I would say 5 through 10 or 5 through 9 due to the fact that you do need some resume quality to get protected. Oregon certainly has that. The really interesting thing is we saw a first of its kind tournament in Vegas, a players NIL era tournament where players were playing for money. And if Oregon playing for money all the time, they'd probably be a 1 seed. But because they really showed up in those 3 games, if you take those games for money out of the equation, they'd be a bubble team. So it's really interesting. But obviously, all kidding aside, they've earned their way with that resume, but the metrics are scary because once Oregon slips out of the top 4, they could really, really take a nosedive. I do believe that the committee of recent years has leaned on those performance metrics to seed the 5 through 9 lines more specifically, whereas resume matters for that 4 spot. So they're still there, but really can't take much more. Another bad loss last night to UCLA by 20 plus. So we'll see where it goes from here. And a quick shout out to Utah Valley. Had an awesome week last week. 2 road wins at Cal Baptist, at Seattle U. Very difficult to do on a tight turnaround. And now they have the big game tomorrow night at Grand Canyon. Planning to be at that one. So can't wait, Wolverines. Good job so far.
Yeah, McNeese, that would probably be a pretty popular pick there. McNeese has won 11 in a row. They haven't lost since December 14th. That was a 3-point loss to Mississippi State. They've had a great season down there. But let's keep moving here to our next pod. And I think there's some intrigue in this one. You see Kentucky, but then St. John's climbing up their way through this bracket. They sit at a 6 seed. And to me, fellas, I'd love to get your take on St. John's playing the winner of that Texas and Arizona State game. Rocco, I'll go back to you here on the St. John's and play-in matchup because St. John's right now is playing as one of the best teams in the Big East, and I'd love to know what your thought is on their ceiling here as we get into February.
Well, I think their ceiling is looking pretty good. They'll need to collect some road wins. They don't have one yet against the field. In fact, they only have 1 win against the field total, which is crazy because they only have 3 total losses. But all the other factors of seeding love the Red Storm right now. They're up to 16 on an average for performance, and they're 18 on average on the resume side, despite not having the quality wins quite yet. And I think a lot of that has to do is just only losing the 3 times. And a lot of those quad 2 and quad 3 wins add up. They're 13-3 in meaningful games. That's extremely strong. 6-3 in the top 2 quadrant-based results. So St. John's continues to go up and up and up. And once they get those key wins, they'll have a real shot for the top 4. In fact, I even had St. John's as a 5 in my bracket and Memphis as a 6. So I just had those 2 flipped, but very, very close. I really have no issues with what the panel came up with. And then in terms of Texas and Arizona State, funny that we have them here right away. Kind of happens that way on Selection Sunday quite often. The last 2 teams I had in the field, maybe that's the last 2 teams we had in the field as a group, makes sense they would play each other and need to play St. John's, a team from an opposite conference that they haven't played before. Texas is getting by with basically they really haven't done, but they're only 7-7 in meaningful games. They're 3-7 in their hardest games. Their best road wins at Oklahoma, which is a good road win, but it's not the top of the SEC. And they have nice home wins with Missouri and Texas A&M headlining those home wins. But the thing that makes you hold your nose is the 275th ranked non-conference strength of schedule. Their best road win outside of Oklahoma is NC State. And outside of those 2, they really don't have any. And they've been pretty average otherwise. So I think if we had some better options, we would probably kick Texas out. But they hang on for today. And then with Arizona State, I would actually stick up for them a little bit more because they have done more away from home. They won in Morgantown. That win over St. Mary's on a neutral has aged extremely well. St. Mary's is up to 22 in the net. And again, the net really matters for your opponents, not for yourself. So the fact that St. Mary's is growing in stature is helping the Sun Devils. And also you have that New Mexico win. So they have 3 very quality wins. I certainly like those wins all away from Tempe better than what Texas has done. But Arizona State's been all over the map. They have an 8th loss. They also have a road win at Colorado. Over 7-5 away from home, though, is typically right in that cookie cutter box that the committee will like to look for that last team or 2 in. I think Arizona State fits the mold, and I like where we have them.
Brad, your thought here on Kentucky right now, sitting at 15-5 on the season. They're 4-3 in the SEC, but they have those losses to Alabama and Vanderbilt. Of course, Alabama, not a bad loss, but Vanderbilt, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson. They've had some trouble away from home. Any thoughts there on Kentucky?
Yeah, sure. So I might be in the minority here, but I actually had Kentucky as my final 2 seed. And here's why. Kentucky's 6-4 against Q1A opponents. Only one other team in the country has that, and that's Auburn. And I think what the committee is always looking at, they always say, who have you beaten? Where did you beat them? And Kentucky beat Duke on a neutral court. They won at Tennessee. And I think those 2 wins, and they beat Florida. So you have wins over 1 seeds, 2 projected 1 seeds, projected 2 seeds. They have the top tier wins, and they have some top tier wins away from home. And I think for me, that's something that kind of separates them from some of these other teams that are, in the 2 or 3 seed line. So I believe their ceiling is a little bit higher than some of these teams based on what they've already accomplished. Now you got to keep at it, and the SEC provides so many opportunities, which is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because every game, just about every single game, is difficult. So you could start piling up wins, which is probably going to prevent you from rising up the seed lines a little bit. But I have no problem with them being a 3 seed. They're my last 2 seed, but I am totally cool with that. In terms of St. John's, as we see here, like Rocco mentioned, beat 1 team in the field. That's the only reason why that they are not higher than most of their fan base thinks they should be. The good thing is that they still get to play Marquette twice, home and away. They still get to go to UConn. They still get to play Creighton, and they play UConn at home. So they have the opportunities to move up. So the ceiling is not limited for them, which is a great thing. They just got to take advantage of those opportunities.
All right, now let's close out the South Region with the 7-10 and 2-15 games. And we'll see there in the 7-10, it's Mizzou and San Diego State, and then Purdue as the 2 seed here in the region. Brad, that 7-10 game with Mizzou out of the SEC and then, of course, San Diego State. What do you think about that one and kind of where Mizzou is at this point at 16-4?
I think Missouri right now, I think they're perfectly seeded. I have them as a 7 seed as well. I think they're right there on that, they should be in, but they're not a lock type of team. Uh, Based on who they've beaten, they have that road win at Florida, which is going to hold up really well the whole season. They also beat Kansas. So they're a team that will likely be in the NCAA tournament if they continue to take care of business, beat the teams that you're supposed to beat. And I think when you're looking at the SEC, there aren't too many opportunities for bad losses. So that sort of helps everybody in the SEC, and why we have up to 13 teams that are currently likely going to be in this bracket. We still have to wait and see. But it's nuts. I mean, that would be an all-time record for any conference. And I think ultimately teams are going to start knocking off other teams. And do I think 13 are going to get in? My guess is probably not, but I could definitely see 12 getting in. And I think that record could be broken. In terms of the potential matchup against San Diego State, nearly had a bad loss against San Jose State the other night, came back in the second half. That was huge because they could ill afford a quad 4 loss. That would have, been awful for their resume. But right now, where it stands, they have wins over Creighton and Houston is arguably the hottest team in the country right now, and it's on a neutral court. So as long as they can avoid that poor loss, San Diego State should be in the mix. However, they are still a bubble team at the moment. Got to keep trying to get some more quality wins in that league. There's only a few teams that will really help them improve their seeding. But avoiding that quad 4 loss and avoiding any future quad 4 loss is paramount for them if they want to feel good about heading into Selection Sunday.
And Rocco, Purdue snakes around there as the 2 seed in this region, playing Bryant as the auto. Purdue, I mean, they've certainly had their moments this season. What do you think about the Boilermakers?
I've got them on that 2-3 cutoff, but I still give the nod to Michigan State, a team in their league, based on the fact that Michigan State's only lost twice. I know we're all waiting for Michigan State to play the meat of their schedule, which they clearly haven't. But at the end of the day, if you're a 2-loss power conference leader, now again, when we get to the actual selection process, we'll know who all the automatic qualifiers are, or the league leaders with number 1 seeds in their conference tournament. So when the actual committee discusses it, you have to have a team representing the league. In this case, of course, that'd be Michigan State. The other thing about Michigan State is they're 7-2 away from home, whereas Purdue's is 6-4. Purdue's got the better road win and more wins against the field. So I certainly see their argument a little bit better performance metrics so far, and they've been dominant in a couple of their wins, as we've seen lately. But they also took a home loss. That's something Michigan State has not done. And so the difference between them is Purdue's taking on 3 extra losses versus Michigan State. And so I have Purdue 9th overall, above Kentucky, who had 10th overall. So it's really interesting to see them both as a 2-3 in the same region. As for San Diego State, obviously a much younger team this year, breaking in new parts. They've shown signs of immaturity. Wayne McKinney actually had to rescue them at Air Force in overtime. They won by 1 point in overtime, then almost lost at home with San Jose State. So they've been this close to being in a real big mess of trouble, but they did beat Houston. They did beat Creighton back in Vegas. Yes, it was for money. Yes, it still counts. And so, the Aztecs are fine. I think the exciting thing for Aztecs fans is last time they went to the national championship game, they came out of the South region, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. And one final thought here that we didn't talk about as I look back on this bracket, you see Kentucky and St. John's there potentially in that 3-6 game. Rick Pitino playing Kentucky potentially in a second-round game. I mean, there is a lot of intrigue there in a potential Kentucky and St. John's matchup there in the second round, and that's certainly something that we all would love to see. So that was the South region, and now let's take a look here before we go to our first break. We're going to keep it rolling, and we're going to go right into the reveal of our second region here on the Fielding the 68 Bracketology, and we'll take a look at the West, where Iowa State gets the 1 seed playing Marist, and Clemson and UConn. What a 8-9 game there. Clemson out of the ACC, and then UConn sitting at 15-6 as the 9 game with a chance to play Iowa State in the second round. Brad, we'll start with you here. Clemson and UConn in an 8-9 matchup.
That would be some matchup. And I think if that's the case, I think UConn is going to end up being underseeded. Of course, they're still waiting on Liam McNeely. I know he's a game time decision for their next game at Marquette. Uh, I think the committee is going to have a difficult time seeding them, but we're going to have to see how they play once he comes back. I think that's going to be very important because their resume without him is that of a 9 seed at best. So it's going to be important for them to get back to where they were prior to that. In terms of Clemson, I actually had them a little bit higher. I had them as a 7 seed. I think they're pretty safe in the field. You're not a lock because the ACC has so many landmines that if they compile a Q4 loss here or there, which is certainly possible, they'll start to get into trouble. But they're currently 3-2 against Quad 1 opponents, and they of course beat Kentucky. They won at Pittsburgh, who's a bubble team. Who they beat Wake Forest, who's a bubble team. So they could definitely improve on that resume. But 17-4 overall record, 9-1 in the ACC is tremendous. And when you look at their overall metrics across the board, they're mid to upper 20s, which kind of places them, in that 7-8 range. But again, when you're playing in the ACC and the Big East, those conferences, those teams are at a little bit of a disadvantage as compared to the Big 12, the SEC, and the Big 10, because there are so many opportunities for that resume to take a significant hit. And they don't have as many opportunities to move the needle. So every matchup you get, if we're looking at the at the ACC, every matchup that you get, and in the Big East, you got to take advantage of it. You got to take advantage of those matchups, or else you're going to have another team from a power conference league that passes you by because look, it might take them a couple opportunities to defeat, one of those NCAA tournament at large teams, but chances are they're going to get it and they'll pass you.
Well, I'll tell you what, fellas, for the field of 68 to have Terrence Oglesby and Rob Doster go up against each other in an 8-9 matchup would be that'd be incredible content, to say the least. So let's go over to you, Rocco, for the Iowa State thought there as a 1 seed.
Yeah, well, I think that Iowa State, of course, had the crazy disaster in Tucson at the end there to lose on the shot from 60 feet out and then get dominated overtime against the Wildcats, a game they could have iced from the line and created all these fouling debates, necessarily or unnecessarily. I'll let you decide. But Iowa State is still very strong and a very worthy selection for the last number 1 seed. And it was between them and Tennessee for a long time, and Tennessee going out and taking a home loss, although they lost to a very good Kentucky team. Losing at home, there's really no room for that when you're wanting to be a 1 seed. The Volunteers made this decision a piece of cake, I'll be honest. So Iowa State it is. And good news for the Cyclones. They would, in this case, be sent to Milwaukee. Nice little friendly drive up there from Ames for the Cyclones. And, Marist, great story as well. John Dunn, been a legendary coach there for years and years and years, trying to break through to the tournament. In a big 3-way tie for first right now, we're all giving Marist the nod. We'll see how that one shakes out in the Metro Atlantic. And I can't look at Clemson UConn without thinking about the 1990 Sweet 16, you guys. Like the Scotty Burrell to Tate George pass. Might be dating myself a little bit. I was very little at the time, but that's one of the all-time iconic plays. And it probably would have been the iconic all-time play of the 90s if Christian Laettner didn't happen 2 years later against Kentucky. So for those longtime UConn and Clemson fans, you know what I'm talking about.
All right, Rocco, you mentioned Arizona and what they did the other night against Iowa State. Let's go down to the 4 and 5 seeds here in this pod, and you'll see Arizona playing Arkansas State in a 5-12 matchup, and then Ole Miss, another SEC team there, playing Jacksonville State in a 4-13 game. Rocco, we see the SEC, and it was, we were talking before we went on the air today about how hard it was to seed the SEC just because of the amount of teams that they had and where can you slot them? What can you do with this conference? And Ole Miss here, they get a 4 seed.
Yeah, I had Ole Miss as a strong 5. Honestly, you could put Ole Miss and Mississippi State, as funny as it sounds, they're the 2 Mississippi big schools. And it's very hard to pick one or the other. They have so many things that are in common, but also different. I ended up going with Mississippi State in that comparison. And, part of this goes back to what I said about Oregon. So if you want to be a top 4 protected seed, which we'll see in their reveal, in a few weeks after the Super Bowl, I believe. So probably 3 weeks from now. One of the things they really care about is your actual resume, what you did away from home. And with Mississippi State's damage and Ole Miss's damage, it's very similar. Ole Miss won at Bama and Louisville. Terrific wins. But that quad 1 category with your top 9 games, Ole Miss has played 9 of them. They're 4-5. Mississippi State just slightly better at 4-4. And they also can nearly I know they don't have the weight of an Alabama win on the road, but they have Memphis and Vanderbilt, 2 very tough places to win. And in general, Mississippi State being 8-3 on the road versus Ole Miss's 6-4 away neutral is a clear delineation. And I think the metrics actually backed up Mississippi State by a smidge as well on that last final check. So it's super close. So I'm okay on either decision. We'll see where Mississippi State lands. As for Arizona, I know some folks out there might have them already in their top 4. I just personally don't think the committee would view them as a team quite worthy of a protected seed due to the fact that their resume shows they're still 4-6 in their 10 hardest games. They have 1 win in that quad 1A category, and it's that West Virginia. Still a very good win. But when you have options like the Mississippi schools who have 2 of those types of wins, you really can't factor in the performance stuff quite yet. Once you do factor in that performance stuff, that's why Arizona is my number 17 overall. They're my best 5 seed because they're clearly the most dangerous of the options. But they've got to get a little bit more of a secure resume, in my opinion, to get up to that top 4. And playing a dangerous Arkansas State team, I might add, in this draw. A team that may not have hit their full potential. You saw glimpses of it when they won at Memphis, which is why they're on the 12 line, because they have had some shaky losses along the way. But again, another Power 5 level starting 5, the Red Wolves. We've seen Arizona get knocked off before. I'm sure they wouldn't be too comfortable with this draw.
Yeah, Brad, I was just going to go to you with that same thought about Arizona and Arkansas State. I mean, we saw Arkansas State earlier in the season. They lost by 9 at Alabama. They have the win over Memphis. They do have some 150 to 200 type losses as well. But, this is a dangerous team playing Arizona. Anything there on that 5-12 game?
I mean, I would certainly take Arkansas State in that game. I mean, that's the 5-12 matchups, as we know. I mean, it hasn't been of late. It hasn't been there haven't been nearly as many upsets as it used to be. But that's one for sure. Just taking a look at, they won at Memphis, so they're more than capable of knocking off Arizona. And I actually have Arizona as a 6th seed at the moment based on their result-based metrics. Strength of record right now is 30. And I know Rocco touched on it as well. Those metrics are not quite there yet. It'd be nice if they can pick up some more victories over some of the top tier teams in the Big 12. It'll help. But their predictive metrics, their net, their KenPom are extremely good. So their ceiling is relatively high. But I think they need to do a little bit more in conference play to get there. And then as far as just to touch base on Ole Miss and Mississippi State, I do have Ole Miss on that 4 line. Big part of the reason, road wins. They won at Alabama and at Louisville. Anytime you could win games away from home against high quality teams, and especially Alabama, who I currently have as the number 2 overall seed, that helps immensely.
All right, let's go to this next pod where we're going to find the second half of the Dayton matchup. Actually, not here. I thought it was not here, but Kansas and Michigan, also Pitt and Northern Colorado in these matchups here. Kansas gets the 3 seed. Michigan gets a 6 seed. Brad, how solid there is Kansas on the 3 line?
Yeah, Kansas, I would say, is pretty solid. They're actually my last 3 seed at the moment. But you take a look at Kansas's resume, 13th strength of record. Their all their result metrics are top 15. Their predictives are all top 12. And it comes down to who have you beaten? And they beat Duke and Michigan State, both on a neutral court. Also won at UCF, beat them twice. UCF almost won at Kansas, which would have been a disaster. Can't lose again at home after their last unbelievable loss at home to Houston, which I think totally opened up the door for Houston to get a 1 seed, but I'm sure we'll touch base on that later. But yeah, I think Kansas is really like a 3-4 at the moment with room to grow to get eventually get on that 2 line if they continue to play strong down the stretch. And then as far as the other matchup, Michigan and Pittsburgh, I actually have Michigan as my last 5. Don't have an issue with them being where they are. They're 3-2 against quad 1 opponents. Again, another team that has some high quality road wins. They won at UCLA and they won at Wisconsin. So for me, it comes down to when I'm tight between 2 different teams, comparing resumes, I think who has those wins over the upper echelon seeded teams is going to get the slight bump, assuming everything else checks out. And then Pittsburgh, not safe. They got a huge win this past week against North Carolina, a fellow bubble team. But Pittsburgh is just 1-5 against quad 1 opponents. And their best win of the season is at Ohio State, which is definitely getting better as each week progresses. Ohio State is on the upswing, so that win is looking better. And beating North Carolina and West Virginia, 2 teams that are fighting for a spot. West Virginia in at the moment, and North Carolina on the outside looking in. It helps, but they got to do some more work. They really do. Just a 43 strength of record. And as we'll continue to talk about, the ACC has limited opportunities. So when you get those opportunities, you got to take advantage of them. And right now, if we take a look at Pittsburgh's schedule and who they have left on their schedule, huge game tomorrow at Wake Forest, a team that's on the bubble. That's something that they could really use. They still get to play at North Carolina, and they still get to play at Louisville. So all of their games against NCAA tournament caliber teams that are left are on the road. So every one of those games are going to be tough. And every other game that they have at home is against a team that will not be receiving an at-large bid. So you can ill afford to lose those games. So it's a long way to go for this team. Can they survive the landmines that are on their schedule? And can they steal one of these games on the road to really improve where they're at right now?
All right, now, Brad, I'm going to go to you here for the last pod of the West region, and we're going to finish things up with Utah State and Ohio State in a 7-10 matchup, and then Florida gets the 2 seed all the way out west in San Francisco. First, your thoughts, Rocco, on the 7-10 game with Utah State out of the Mountain West, and then Ohio State, of course, there from the Big Ten.
Yeah, I mean, Utah State has been a little bit of a victim to the power conference teams being able to constantly build their resume. I feel like not a lot has changed besides Utah State's loss to UNLV about a week and a half ago. It's about the only bad they've done. They made up for that loss this week by beating UNLV at home. But what they've had to accept is a UCLA team that's won 5 in a row that just passed them, a Maryland team that got hot that just passed them, a Louisville team that refuses to lose, a red hot Texas Tech team. So they've been bypassed by all these teams, and there's nothing the Aggies can do about that except for control what's in front of them. And quite honestly, they've had some sluggish results, even in their wins, and that hurts in this level of seeding when you're between the 5 through 10, like I talked about before. And they're losing just a lot of these comparisons and getting stuck with the 7. But I think resume-wise, they would project out as more of like a 5 seed. So Utah State, they're the clear leader of the Mountain West right now. They're the team that's the most surefire to get in. They just got to keep bolstering that those road wins at San Diego State and St. Mary's aren't going to matter later. So they're about as solid as you can ask for. It's just a seeding issue right now in their case. And then with Ohio State, this is probably the most polarizing team in the tournament, in my opinion. So, I do the process the same way the committee does. It's not a straight line situation the way I do it. I select my 37 at-larges first, much like they do, and then you go through seeding. 2 completely different processes. So with the selection process, Ohio State's my last team in the field. But when you go and seed everybody in order based on their performance, mostly it's a balance with that in the resume. Ohio State shoots up because they've got a road win at Purdue. They got the win over Kentucky out at MSG. They've got some really, really good things to like. The really big dilemma with the Buckeyes is their 7-8 record. They're not a successful team. 15 games in meaningful action, and they haven't even won half of them. So the losses have to mean something at a certain point. Typically, a 7-8 team I would not have in, and I did not have them in on Monday. But I think you can make some exceptions in extraordinary cases where I have Kentucky as the 10th best team in the country, Purdue as the 9th best. They beat them both away from home. You add a win against Texas. I believe that was a neutral in Vegas on opening night. So there's just enough juice to throw them in, but I'm holding my nose with the Buckeyes. And then if they do get in, they should be a 10 seed because they have so much promise and power when they play well.
All right, gentlemen, 2 regions down, 2 regions to go. We are going to take a break. This is the Fielding the 68 full bracket reveal presented by Rhythm.
Now that the college basketball season is in full swing, you need to make sure that you have access to the best betting tool on the market, the Rhythm app. Spelled RITHMM, is a data-backed app that uses AI and analytics to identify inefficiencies in betting lines and the player prop market that will allow you, the user, to profit. You can create customized, analytics-driven betting models tailored to your personal preferences as a bettor. Users have access to up-to-the-second against the spread data. And if you're like me and you understand pictures better than numbers on a screen, Rhythm's internal trend analysis provides you with the kind of graphs that will allow you to evaluate past results and project future performance in a visual way. Every Division I college basketball team is included in the Rhythm's metrics. Free subscribers to the Field of 68 Daily will get 25% off for a Rhythm subscription. Use the QR code on the screen to sign up or download at the link in the description.
This is Fielding the 68 presented by Rhythm. On Selection Sunday, use Rhythm's bracket generator, proven to perform 35% better than the average ESPN bracket. Don't wait. Download Rhythm today and transform how you bet, bracket, and enjoy college basketball. I'm Paul Fritschner, alongside the experts Rocco Miller and Brad Wachtel. We have revealed 2 of the 4 NCAA tournament regions here on Fielding the 68 today. This is our first full bracket reveal. We will do this every couple of weeks here as we go through the show. Right now, we're going to go through the next and final 2 regions of the bracket. So let's get going here, as we've already seen Auburn and Iowa State as the first 2 number 1 seeds that we've revealed. Now we get to Duke, playing the winner of the play-in game of Southern and Omaha, and then Gonzaga and Oklahoma in that 8-9 game. Brad, I'll start with you here. Duke gets the number 1 seed in the East, playing in Newark.
Yeah, so as of now, obviously Duke is on the 1 line. They are my 3rd overall number 1 seed. Alabama, for me, jumped them based on the quality wins that they have on their resume, including their result-based metrics. In terms of that other matchup, so here's where I want to start. Gonzaga. Gonzaga is a very interesting resume, and I know Rocco brought this up when we were talking about the last region. With regards to Ohio State. Ohio State and their under 500 record against quad 1 and 2 opponents. Well, Gonzaga, if you compare Gonzaga and Ohio State's resume, look, Ohio State 4-6 against quad 1 opponents. Gonzaga's 2-5. Ohio State 7-8 against quad 1 and 2. Gonzaga's 5-6. Strength of record for Gonzaga is worse than Ohio State's. Their predictive metrics are strong. There's no question about it. But I don't think a team like Gonzaga, by any means, is a lock. And I know nobody mentioned that, but I don't think they're a lock by any means. They have some quality wins. They beat Baylor, who's a bubble team. They beat Arizona State, who's a bubble team. They beat Indiana, who's a bubble team. But other than that, they didn't really pick up, any quality wins away from home in non-conference play, which is something they normally do. So I have them as an 8 seed right now. I think they're properly seeded. But they have a lot of work to do. And I think if they somehow lose a game to somebody towards the bottom of that conference, there's a chance that they could be falling down to that last 4 in, first 4 out category, because they just don't have that top end quality on their resume. And I think that's a little bit of a surprise, and it was a little bit of a surprise to me when you start really looking close at their resume. And then as far as Oklahoma goes, I have Oklahoma as a 9 seed as well. Pretty solidly as a 9. Beat Louisville and Arizona on neutral courts, also beat Michigan on a neutral court. So they did their work in non-conference play, obviously getting off to that tremendous start. And they're just 2-5 in SEC play. Conference record doesn't matter to a certain extent. You want to just pick up some more quantity of victories to get that record closer to 500 to feel good about themselves. So I think they're both appropriately seeded at the time, but neither team is a lock.
Rocco, the last time I hosted this show, this was the first Fielding the 68 we did a couple of weeks ago. You gave a long kind of point about Oklahoma and where Oklahoma was, what their seeding was, and the potential of Oklahoma getting left out of the field just because of kind of the depth of the SEC and the fact that they might just not have the resume there at the end of the season. Here they are as a 9 seed. What's your kind of consensus on where Oklahoma is right now?
Yeah, they've been able to stay above water a little bit since then. But I think my point holds true. I was looking at Oklahoma as a 6-12 or worse SEC record. Now, it's difficult to consistently do that throughout the end of January here and now into February. Some of those answers will become more clear, and I think it's still a little murky for Oklahoma. They took another loss the other night to Texas A&M. Now, none of these are bad losses per se, but eventually the bad's going to start outweighing the good if they end up 6-12, or God forbid 5-13 or worse. So my main point in that segment, 2 weeks ago, was to say that the Sooners, or anybody else for that matter, once you get to 6-12 or worse in your league, you're probably going to have too much bad to accept the good, unless the good for some reason is a road win at Auburn or at Alabama, something extremely heavyweight and unprecedented. So it's hard to foresee that with some of what we know about Oklahoma. They have some matchup disadvantages in this league that we've seen. But for now, they did get the road win at Arkansas, which gave them finally a road win against somebody in the top 2 quads. Arkansas is struggling right now, but that win could grow with age, and they're constantly playing big games. So for them, I think it's actually pretty straightforward. Just get to 7-11 or better. That non-conference resume is still there. The Louisville win looks better than ever. The Arizona win's getting better. The Michigan solid. So they're okay if they handle enough business. They don't even have to handle all their business. They just need to handle enough business, and that will be the great balancing act of the Oklahoma Sooners this year. And quickly on Gonzaga, I agree high level with Brad here. They definitely have a lot more to prove. Big game at St. Mary's tomorrow night. Obviously huge around here where I'm at in the Bay Area. If they get that road win, they'll start to be on a lot more solid footing. And the WCC is a lot deeper, so they're getting more quad 2 and 3 opportunities, which is saving them in some ways, because if you do what some of the committee members do, which is take away quad 4, they're still a nice and safe 9-5 or 9-6, which is much different than the 7-8 of Ohio State. So that's kind of more or less where I'm seeing Ohio State in a bigger danger zone. They're just in a weird place where they never played a quad 3 game. They also, probably bought teams that are a little too low down the totem pole to matter. But again, Ohio State's a Big Ten team, much like Oklahoma. They have plenty of chances to prove their worth.
All right, we already have seen one SEC team right there in Oklahoma in this region. Now we're about to see a second SEC team, Texas A&M, the 4 seed in the East, and then Illinois as the 5 seed in the East, playing a very talented UC Irvine team that nearly had a slip up last night against Long Beach State, but was able to get it done in overtime in a 5-12 matchup that would have a lot of eyes on it. Brad, back to you here on, I really want to talk about this Illinois and UC Irvine game, because it's one of the more intriguing games, I think, that we've revealed so far.
Yeah, definitely intriguing. And again, we're revealing this bracket on January 31st. So it's not Selection Sunday. What is Illinois' team going to look like? I think that's the most important question. Because Illinois at full strength has a ceiling of a Final Four. I think most would agree with that. With the way they've played of late has been kind of suspect. Obviously, losing last night at Nebraska, which is not an easy place to play. It's not that big of a deal. I know Nebraska was just 2-7 in conference play, but Nebraska is fighting for a bid in the NCAA tournament right now. So yeah, I think they need to kind of get back to full strength. And even if they don't get back to full strength, one of their big men has mono right now that could keep you out a long time. But they got to start righting the ship, take care of business at home, and figure out a way to get back on track. I do think this would be a heck of a matchup, especially as it stands today. Would love to see a matchup like that. UC Irvine came in with a net of 50. They're 4-1 against quad 1 and 2 opponents. Haven't beaten any high major teams, but they've gotten some quality wins away from home. They're 11-3 away from home and have a strength of record that's 49 and a KPI that's actually of 29, which is unbelievable for a team that could potentially be seeded 12. So that would definitely be an interesting matchup that would be fun to see, and we'll see what Illinois what they bring to us come Selection Sunday.
Rocco, you look at Texas A&M there on the 4 line. They have that the win over Purdue in Indianapolis. They have a win over Texas. They've beaten Texas Tech. They have a win at home over Ohio State. Texas A&M at 16-5 right now on the season, and they get a 4 seed here in the East.
Yeah, so I had A&M as my top 4 seed. They were close to a 3. Kansas being my last ranked of the 3s. And you could, the committee would have a lot to take Texas A&M above the seeding exercise. Texas A&M has 9 wins against the field right now. A couple of those towards the bottom are very, very bubble-ish wins, but they still count. And they do have the road win at Ole Miss. That's a really nice anchor to go along with those neutral court wins over Purdue, Texas Tech, and Creighton. That's a heck of a trio as well. So Texas A&M's got a lot at the top of their resume with 3 wins in that 1A group, the very top of quad 1. And then, of course, 11-5 in their 16 hardest games and no losses after that. So they've handled all their other business. They've been about as solid and steady as you could ask for without being a 1 or a 2. But obviously, I think they've had a front-loaded SEC schedule as well. I would imagine, without looking at it right now, that's going to lighten up at some point because it seems like these guys are in a big game almost every game, and they win one, they lose one, and so far that's working out just fine for them. But their resume is awesome. They average out at a 7.5 in the resume ranks. If you just look at the WAB in the SOAR strength resume, I call it SOAR. Don't ask me why. But so I really like what A&M's bringing to the table. Long story short, Samford on the other end, they've been up and down in the SoCon so far, waiting to see them peak. So far, still getting the nod, and obviously buckyball dangerous, as Kansas found out last year in the first round.
All right, let's keep it moving here in the East, and we'll go to the number 3 seed, Michigan State, playing Akron out of the MAC, and then Texas Tech with the 11 seed Drake. We've had a lot of debate here on Drake and who gets that auto bid and everything else. They get that 11 seed in a 6-11 game for Texas Tech and Drake. Rocco, when you look at Michigan State and what they've been able to do this year under Tom Izzo and how well they've played for the first 20 games of this season, 18-2 right now, playing a team that's not too far away from them in Akron.
Right. Yeah. And, we'll talk to Dagan about this one down the road. We don't have the first 2 round cities listed, so we'll play pretend. But I do think if this was in Cleveland, it wouldn't actually be allowed because Akron's too close to Cleveland. But let's roll with it. It's a fun matchup. Akron 8-0 in the MAC, taking the MAC by storm, but really only one meaningful win for Akron, so they've slipped into the 14 spot. Otherwise, a normal year in the MAC, a 15-5 Akron team would be a 12. But that kind of shows how down the MAC is right now. In terms of Michigan State, I addressed it a little bit earlier. I think from a committee standpoint, you have to respect the 18-2 record. A lot of those games now are league games. 16 of them I have down as meaningful games in the top 3 quadrants, 14-2, of course, in those. And 2 high-end wins anchored by now. If we're calling Ohio State a tournament team, then we got to give Michigan State credit for winning at Ohio State, I think. So I think there's just enough evidence there to keep them as a safe 2 seed. We're going to learn so much about this team in February. Just look at the February Michigan State schedule. Every single game is a hard game. That's where I'm at with that. Texas Tech Drake, extremely interesting. The two coaches, Grant McCaslin and Ben McCollum, go way back. They actually scrimmaged each other, and I was a little bit of a sicko and followed that on the SAT broadcast because they didn't shut it off privately. So these two teams would know each other extremely well from that scrimmage. That's when I think Drake got a lot of us mid-major guys' attention because that scrimmage, I think, was only a Texas Tech 4-point win. Overall, Texas Tech is a 6 I can live with. In fact, I bumped them down to a 6. I had them as a 5 on Monday. They've been tough because their performance stuff is through the roof. They're playing great, and I think their talent matches that. But the wins aren't quite there yet. They've only got one win against the field. They don't have a win against the field away from home. So there's a lot of boxes they need to check. And I'm unsure about Texas Tech. They do have the neutral court loss to St. Joseph's that they have to own, and a home loss to UCF based on UCF's net comes across as a subpar loss. So 2 subpar losses, not enough on the good side. That's why Texas Tech's not a top 4, and I agree with the 6 seed that our team has.
Brad, let's finish up the East region here. We'll go to the 7-10 game, and we'll look at UCLA and Georgia here in this 7-10 game, as well as Tennessee getting the 2 seed in the East. UCLA and Georgia. UCLA has really turned things around here in the last couple of weeks. Of course, Mick Cronin was fired up in his press conference there in the middle of January after that road trip to Maryland and Rutgers that did not go well. That was a disaster of a road trip for UCLA. They lost 4 out of 5. But then since then, 5 straight wins, including that blowout win last night over Oregon. UCLA's turned things around, and they find themselves there in a 7-10 game against Georgia.
Yeah, and I think UCLA is actually better than a 7 seed. I actually have them on the 6 line, especially after blowing out Oregon last night. UCLA is now 5-5 against quad 1 opponents, 8-6 against quad 1 and 2 opponents. They have some strong wins. They beat Arizona on a neutral court. They beat Gonzaga on a neutral court. They swept Oregon. And we talked about them earlier, how good of wins those are. So they had a couple bad weeks, and that really brought them down. But it seems to me that they are back on the up and up after these last couple weeks. Mick Cronin is one of the best coaches in the country, so no surprise there. No problem with them being a 7 right now, but I would have them on the 6 line based on those top-tier wins. And when it comes to Georgia, for me, they are right above the last 4 in. Another team that is not safe. They have some work to do. They have the wins. They beat St. John's on a neutral court. They beat Kentucky. They beat Oklahoma. No quality road wins, though. That's, Rocco was talking about checking boxes. That's a box that they could really, really use to kind of get out of that 10, 11 seed range. I think that would help immensely. But other than that, I feel like they are appropriately seeded at the time. But playing the SEC, and you could find yourself out in a week. So keep winning games.
My last question for you, Brad, here on that little pod there was Tennessee. They've lost 3 out of 4 here. Where is their standing right now as far as the potential to get back into the 1 seed conversation?
They can definitely get back in the 1 seed conversation. They're on the 2 line. For me, they are the number 2, the second 2 seed. You could really put them 2. You could put them 3. You could kind of put them in a couple spots. But all of their metrics across the board are so solid. And take a look at who they've beaten. They won at Louisville. They won at Illinois. They won at Texas. The win at Illinois is not looking as good as it did a few weeks ago, which kind of hurts. They do have those quality wins, and they still have some opportunities on their schedule to move up the board. So by no means are they out of the mix for a 1 seed. When it's all said and done, though, I think it's going to be difficult for 3 SEC teams to get on that 1 line. I think Houston is really lurking as a team right now to potentially climb into that 1 seed line in the next week or two. That win at Kansas was something that was huge for them. And they have the best predictive metrics of any team in the country. So the team that I'm watching is Houston, but I think Tennessee is certainly still in the mix to get back up to a 1 seed.
All right, gentlemen, 3 regions down, 1 region to go. We have the Midwest left. That is the last region to talk about. And again, we will get to all the bubble conversation here to end the show. The last 4 in, the first 4 out, all of that will close the show. But first, we have to reveal the Midwest, and we'll start with Alabama, who gets the 1 seed in Indianapolis, playing Central Connecticut. And in the 8-9 game, Rocco, it's St. Mary's and Baylor. What a game here this weekend. St. Mary's in that WCC Classic, close to home for you with Gonzaga. And then, of course, Baylor as the 9 seed at 13-7 right now. Just your overall thought on this pod.
Yeah, I got to start with that St. Mary's Baylor matchup. Very, very intriguing. You know, Baylor's been leaking some oil, let's just say, of late, falling short late in games. They got that BYU game to overtime the other night. Would have been a really nice road win. Couldn't get it done though, and they took a home loss to TCU that really got the wheels turning towards the bad. And you know, today was the first day where Baylor ended up on my bubble list. They're not quite on the bubble yet, but they're starting to get compared more to bubble teams, in my opinion. I think that's a little bit of a danger zone. They need to right the ship. They've played 7 tournament level teams. They're 2-5 in those games, anchored by a road win at Arizona State, one of our last teams in. And the St. John's win, if you talk to a St. John's fan about that game, good luck. Good luck getting out of there alive. So, you know, I'm saying that because that easily could have been a loss. And now you're looking at a very average team. They're 7-7 in meaningful games. They're 2-5 in their quad 1 and 2 away contests. Adding that Utah win, I thought was important to keep them steady on the 9 seed line. But there's a lot to be sorted out with Baylor and where they're headed. It hasn't looked entirely great yet, but we know what Coach Drew and that program and the talent of a guy like Edgecombe and others can bring. Roach has been hurt. So a lot of wait and see going on in Waco. St. Mary's, I just covered them the other night. Like I said before we got on the air, they had a 30-0 run at a really good Santa Clara team. This St. Mary's team is the most well-prepared team year in and year out, which is why they always turn it on at this exact same time. I feel like I'm watching the same movie every year for 4 or 5 straight years with this Gales program, and that is an absolute compliment to Randy Bennett and his staff and their ability to prepare and take away the opponent's ability to do what they want to do and understand their tendencies in a lot of cases better than they do. Should be an incredible matchup against Gonzaga tomorrow. Definitely check out how that goes. But St. Mary's is in a stretch right now of about 10 games. I think they just went through 3 of them against the meat of the WCC. So next week, I know they go to San Francisco, a team they've had great success against, but it'll be a road game. And they go to Oregon State. That's what I think is the tricky one. It'll be a tight turnaround, a Thursday, Saturday. And Oregon State's already beat Gonzaga at home. They've already beat Santa Clara at home. They've almost beat Oregon at home. Oregon State's had a great home court advantage this year. That'll be a game to watch next week. But otherwise, St. Mary's through the roof with seeding. Obviously, you blow out good teams, you're going to skyrocket up the net, and they're doing it again.
All right, let's move down into the 4-5 games here. And again, it's out of the SEC. Mississippi State playing George Mason from the A-10. Tony Skinn's team, they've ripped off 6 straight wins. They only have 1 loss since December 17th when they lost to Duke. That loss on January 4th against Rhode Island. Right now, George Mason's 16-5 this year, playing a Mississippi State team that's 16-5. And Wisconsin has earned a 4 seed, taken on Yale out of the Ivy. Brad, that 4-13 game, Yale always, making noise here when it comes down the stretch into March, playing a Wisconsin team right now at 16-5.
Yeah, no question. That would be a tough game to pick. The Ivy League, especially over the course of the last few years, has a history of knocking off some power conference teams. I actually have Wisconsin as my top 5 seed at the moment. So I have no issue with them being on the 4 line. They're 5-5 against quad 1 opponents. Just lost at Maryland. Not a bad loss. A surging Maryland team that's been playing unbelievable of late. Wisconsin, you take a look at who they've beaten. the quality of wins are good. They beat Arizona, they beat Pittsburgh on a neutral court, beat Ohio State, beat Nebraska. Just like we say with a couple of these other teams, I'd like to see a true upper echelon win on the road. That's what I'd like to see, to really get them and kind of solidify them as a potential protected seed in the NCAA tournament. So, they have the opportunities in conference play to do that. Their metrics are solid across the board in terms of being a 4 or a 5 seed, but they are currently 0-4 against Q1A road neutral opponents. So, checking boxes, that's a huge box for Wisconsin to check. And that's something they could prove over the course of the next few weeks.
And then how about Mississippi State there on the 5 seed line? We talked about George Mason and what that 5-12 game could be, but out of the SEC, Mississippi State.
Yep, and Mississippi State I have as a 4 seed at the moment, 4-4 against quad 1 opponents. And like Rocco had mentioned earlier, very similar resume to that of Ole Miss. They beat Memphis on the road, won at Vanderbilt, and then they have a couple other quality wins against fringe tournament teams, like a Pittsburgh, SMU on the road, which is not really, you could say they're on the bubble, but SMU has a ton of work to do with beating good teams. But for the most part, they're in okay shape. I like the seed where they're at, and I think everything's good on this side of the bracket so far.
All right, Rocco, now there is a lot of intrigue to me in this next pod. We have the final 2 teams in the bracket. The last 2 win, because we've already revealed 2 of the 4 of the last 4 in that will play in Dayton. But we also have a Louisville team that has played just unbelievably well this year under Pat Kelsey, especially since that blowout loss to Tennessee early in the season. You have Marquette on the 3 line sitting at 18-3. They've kind of been here and there, Marquette has lately, where Marquette has certainly won games, but I think any Marquette fan listening to this would probably tell you that it was a little shaky against Butler, it was a little shaky against DePaul in overtime. They lost to Xavier, but still, there's nothing to take away from the fact that Marquette right now is 18-3 overall. They're 9-1, right in the thick of the Big East title race with a couple of other teams. And you also have Louisville out of the ACC, who, looking at Louisville's schedule, I don't want to say they're going to win the rest of their games this season, but there is a legitimate chance that Louisville could win the rest of their games here into March, because they're going to be favored in every game down the stretch. And then, of course, you have New Mexico and UCF playing in Dayton. All of that is to set up your thought here, Rocco, on we'll start with Marquette on the 3 line, and then we'll get to those final 2 teams in.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, Marquette, they're surviving and advancing in a lot of these league games, as you mentioned, and they wake up this morning with really gaudy records in these areas. If they could be a little more dominant, they would pretty clearly be a top 2 seed, I think. Obviously, the Big East leader and representing the Big East automatic qualifier in our bracket. That road win at Maryland is also getting much better than it was just a couple of weeks ago, with Maryland surging. So they've got those things going for them. I think the problem has been these results have hurt them, and teams like Purdue, Kentucky have passed them, and of course Houston passed everybody. So they were sniffing that 2 seed line last week. Now they're pretty solidly a 3. I think we got them in the right spot. And again, Marquette's got a lot more big games to come. They can't worry about where they're at right now. If they handle their business and improve on the floor, all this seeding talk and all that will take care of itself. Intriguing matchup with Towson. Towson's just been a totally different team since Tyler Tejada got hurt and came back from injury, and he has taken the CAA by storm. I covered their MTE, but was on the broadcast up there in Canada. And this is a team that plays tremendously hard defense, and they're clicking at the right time. This would be a really dangerous 3-14 game. But in the 6-11, obviously Louisville's been the toast of the town on a surging win streak. Very pleasant to watch basketball in Pat Kelsey's system, and doing it shorthanded. They've been down 4 or 5 guys for over a month now. It doesn't seem to matter. And I've been really impressed on how they put it on teams early. Seems like they're going into halftime up 15-20 on almost a nightly basis right now. But the reality is they're still getting compared to all these other contenders, and they're 4-5 in their 9 hardest games. So there's a little bit of a pause there, and they're not going to get chances, like you said, down the stretch to really improve on that. I don't know if they'll get another quad 1 game or not. Kind of depends on how things shake out. SMU is improving. I think they might play them one more time. They do play Stanford in the finale. That's a team I've been impressed by, but Stanford's still pretty far out of the field. So really interesting. But Louisville did get last place in the ACC last year. So they're playing a last place schedule. So that can explain it for anybody confused by it. And they're right in that sweet spot. So that's where I have them. I'm good with it. New Mexico here in the playing game, I don't agree with. But we've seen the committee do this to the Mountains almost every year. So we're probably pretty good at forecasting by screwing over a Mountain West team that I think belongs into the safe bracket. And you could argue the commissioner might want the playing game because there's a financial incentive to get a win there in the play, and it counts the exact same for the exact same amount of units financially as winning a first-round game. So depending on who you ask, it might not be such a bad thing. In general, I like New Mexico's resume. Compared to some of the other bubble options, let's just say that UCLA wins improved. They've got the San Diego State home wins. They've got a couple of wins against the field. They haven't had a lot of chances. They've only played 4 games against tournament teams. They're 2-2, but they're 7-2 in their 9 hardest games. They took a couple suspect losses, of course, the New Mexico State home loss and the road one at San Jose State that I covered over here. But other than that, they've got a couple road wins that are solid at Colorado State, at UNLV, 6-3 road. I mean, I think they're pretty safe. But, obviously I'm open to the committee's ideas because that's why it's a committee.
Brad, what's your opinion there on the 2-11 seeds there in Dayton?
Yeah, they're 2 of my 11 seeds as well. New Mexico kind of has just dropped. For example, a team like Ohio State jumped them, which is why New Mexico has dropped. They're the only team that's in the field that has a quad 4 loss at the moment, which is significant. They did beat UCLA on a neutral. It's quad 3 as of today?
Yeah, because New Mexico State won last night.
Okay. Fine, that's fair.
Gotcha.
Well, they are the only. They're the only team that has multiple quad 3 losses. Then, okay, we'll put it that way.
There you go.
That's in the field. So UCLA they beat San Diego State. They beat so quality wins, 9-1 conference play. I like where they're at. UCF, a team that's just 3-7 against quad 1 and 2 opponents, which is not a good record, but their result-based metrics across the board are all top 40. And they have quality wins at Texas Tech, Arizona State, and beat Texas A&M. So I'm comfortable with where they are based on the fact that their predictive metrics are in the upper 50s, which is really the worst of almost any team that's in the field. So Dayton is where they belong right now.
All right, gentlemen, let's get to the final 4 teams in the first reveal of fielding the 68. Of course, Houston, we knew they would be that last 2 seed there that we haven't seen yet. But in the 7-10 game, you have Vanderbilt under Mark Byington and the resurgence of that Commodore program this year, 16-4 right now. And then Maryland sitting in a 7 seed. Maryland on January 5th was 11-4. They were 1-3 in the Big Ten, and it just didn't look like this season was going to be Maryland's season because at that point they had the win over Ohio State, they had a win over Villanova, but what else did they have? Not a whole lot. They had a loss to Marquette, loss to Purdue, and since then, since January 5th, Maryland has ripped off 6 wins, 6 out of 7, and are looking fantastic right now as they climb up the bracket. Rocco, that 7-10 game between an upstart Maryland team and then Vanderbilt out of the SEC has a lot of intrigue.
Yeah, it does. And interestingly, for both these teams, it's a good thing they've got above the bubble because they have the 2 worst non-conference strength of schedules in the entire bracket. 327 for Maryland, 334 for Vanderbilt. So if they do land closer to the bubble later, that's something you got to keep in mind because history would tell us that they're probably not going to be a first 4 team, either one of them, based on such poor non-conference strength of schedules. However, Maryland, as we've mentioned a couple times leading up to this moment, surging. Got the road win at Illinois, another great road win at Indiana, although Indiana projected to go to a tournament not named the NCAA's right now. It's still a top 70 road win, and these are the types of things Maryland had to do. We've been talking about checking boxes. They've been checking them these last couple of weeks, and now everything looks much prettier for the Terps. 4-4 in their 8 hardest games, 9-5 in their meaningful games, 4-4 in their games away from College Park. Those are the things you need to be able to do. Just go 500 in those really difficult environments, really difficult games, and that includes a loss at Washington that now doesn't even really matter anymore for all intents and purposes. And they're coming in with a top 18 performance average in terms of those measurements. So you could argue all the way up to the 5 seed if you wanted to for the Terps. But I think their resume still needs, even though they've got some meat brewing, some good meat, they got to get a little beefier to get to a 5 or a 4, in my opinion. And based on what the committee has shown us the last couple of years. On Vanderbilt's end, getting those home wins, storming the court over and over again has added up to a safe place for the time being in Nashville. Wins over Tennessee and Kentucky, of course, I'm referring to most recently. But also, 9-4 in their meaningful games, no bad losses. They've sprinkled in a road win at LSU. They're certainly going to want to get one of those bigger road wins in the SEC as they go along, or it's probably mathematically impossible for them to hang on. But for now, it's an awesome story, beautiful team to watch, good experience. Byington did a heck of a job in the transfer portal.
Brad, last thought here before we go to break. You talked earlier about Houston. We see them here on the 2 line. How close is Houston to that last 1 seed?
I think they're very close. And like we mentioned earlier, predictive metrics across the board are number 1 in the country. They needed that top tier win away from home, I think, in order to get in that 1 seed mix. And they got it when they came back and won at Kansas. And then they just won at West Virginia too, another quality win. Of course, they're undefeated in Big 12 play. I think they're certainly in the mix. The way they're playing would not shock me if they get there before the end of the season.
All right, fellas, that was the full bracket. That was a lot of fun. Shout out to Dagan and Trevor and everybody for putting that bracket together, because that was a spectacular way to end the month of January and now kick it into February for all of that bracket talk. But we're not done yet. We have one last thing to do after this break, and it's to talk about the bubble, because there are teams that we saw in the field, but there are teams that are just on the outside looking in that still have work to do. We'll talk about that on the other side of this. This is Fielding the 68, presented by Rhythm.
If you haven't heard by now, we have partnered with BetMGM for the season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for the listeners and the viewers. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using the bonus code FIELD. Deposit at least $10 and place your first wager on any game, and you'll receive up to $1,500 in bonus bets. Go download the BetMGM app and use the code FIELD today.
This is Fielding the 68, presented by Rhythm. Identify mid-majors and underdogs that could upset the field and shake up your bracket. Don't wait. Download Rhythm today and transform how you bet, bracket, and enjoy college basketball. So thanks to everybody for tuning in so far. Hundreds of you watching here on a Friday night, kicking off the weekend with some good old bracketology here. Paul Fritschner, Rocco Miller, Brad Wachtel with you. And we have this one final thing to wrap up the show, and it's maybe the most intriguing part of the bracketology, and it's which teams are right there on the cusp, which teams might find their way into the field, play their way in, and which teams might play their way out over the final 5 weeks of the season. We already talked about the last 4 in pretty in-depth, but just to show it again, here are the last 4 teams into the field as we revealed it a few minutes ago. These are the 4 teams that would be playing in Dayton. You have New Mexico, Texas, UCF, and Arizona State. Brad, any just general thoughts or things that we haven't covered yet? Both of you guys, Brad, I'll start with you. Just anything that we haven't hit on yet for these 4.
The only difference that I have from my last 4 into what you just showed is I have Texas a slot above the last 4 in, and I have Pittsburgh in my last 4 in at the moment. I think Texas's resume is slightly better when you're really picking at straws when you're looking at these last few bubble teams. But other than that, everything looks good. And I think we covered each team.
Rocco, any general thoughts there?
Yeah, similar to Brad, I actually did have Texas and Arizona State as my clear last 2 in. UCF, I had a little safer, I guess, than the consensus. I really didn't debate too much on them. I just like what they've done away from home. They bring something to the table against the field that the others didn't. Well, besides Arizona State, but we explained earlier why they're polarizing. And then I actually had Georgia going to Dayton, which would be I don't really see it finishing that way. They were just the team I was stuck on the most. I felt more solid about Pitt, mainly because of what Brad said about the Bulldogs. They really haven't done much away from home. I think they're 1-5 in their 6 meaningful games away from home. So I think if Georgia wants to stick around, they're obviously in the SEC. They're going to have brutal games every single week. But if they can sprinkle in a couple meaningful road wins, which they're pretty much all meaningful, Georgia can feel a little safer. But right now, another loss, there'll be enough reasons, I think, to take Georgia out.
All right, so that was the last 4 in. Now let's see who our first 4 out are. Let's see these teams that are right on the cusp of the tournament but don't find themselves in the bracket right now. Nebraska, Indiana, BYU, and Wake Forest. Kind of diversity here conference-wise, a couple of Big Ten teams, and BYU out of the Big 12, and Wake Forest out of the ACC, which is, of course, we talked about it so much, not been the ACC of old this year, and Wake Forest a little bit on the outside looking in. Brad, what's your initial reaction here to these first 4 out?
Yep. So I definitely agree with Nebraska being the first team out of the field. Nebraska got a big victory last night against Illinois, a much-needed victory because they've really been slumping of late. They had dropped to 2-7 in league play. So the average fan might say they're 3-7 in league play. How are they almost in the NCAA tournament? Well, you take a look at who they've beaten, and they won at Creighton, which is a enormous win. To go along with beating Illinois and UCLA. Result-based metrics across the board are in the 50s, which is really slots them as a bubble team right on the fringe. I think that they can get back into the field. A few weeks ago we had them, up in the towards the 8-9 range in the field, and I think that they could definitely get back there if they continue to win some games. But you got to win some games and not be in the bottom 3 in the Big Ten and miss out on the Big Ten tournament, because that's obviously not going to cut it. They're just 5-8 against quad 1 and 2 teams. And other than that, they got 4 wins away from home, which is okay, but not great at this time. And so that's one team we'll take a look at. BYU is one team that I actually don't have in my first 4 out. They're actually my 5th team out, so they're pretty close. BYU is just 1-4 against Q1, and you take a look at who they've beaten, and they haven't beaten anybody of note away from home. Beat Arizona State and Baylor, 2 teams that are fighting to get in right now. But I think they have a lot of work to be done, and they got to go get away from home and start beating somebody, because they had a really poor non-conference strength of schedule. So their record away from home is not particularly great. They got to improve that. And Wake Forest, another team, is just 1-6 against quad 1. They just lost at Pittsburgh, as we mentioned earlier. And just one quality win away from home, and that's against a Michigan team who has dropped off a couple seeds down to a projected 6 seed at the moment. They have a big game coming up. Does Wake Forest against who do they play next, Rocco? Tell me who do they play next? Because now I lost my train of thought. They play Pitt. They play Pitt next.
Yeah, I knew it was an important one.
Pitt tomorrow. Yep.
Yeah.
Pitt tomorrow.
And then they also get to. Right. They also still get to travel to Duke at the end of the season, which, you win that game and you'll be in the NCAA tournament. But they got a long way to go and limited opportunities.
Rocco, looking at those first four out, do you agree with that? Is that what you had?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I never look at it as first four out. I know it's made famous by our friend Mr. Lenardi since 1990 on ESPN. But the reality is you're either in or you're out. So all these teams are out for various reasons. So you could call it the next 20 out, the next 2 out. It doesn't matter to me. You're out. And the bottom line is, for my website, I put those 4 in order. So it's funny that we did go with Nebraska, Indiana, BYU, Wake Forest. And what I'm really trying to portray there, Paul, is one win away from getting juicy. You know what I mean? So if Nebraska, who had a great win over Illinois last night, goes out and gets another win, and I'm sure in Big Ten play that will matter, they're back to 500 in their meaningful games. They're 7-8. And the biggest difference between them and Ohio State is Ohio State has the Purdue road win and the neutral court win, whereas Nebraska, they also have nice wins, but Illinois and UCLA were both at home, and then the one good one away from home is at Creighton. If they can get a second one to go along with that, it would start to get a lot more attractive for the Huskers. And I think with Indiana, their records are a little out of whack in the top half of the bracket, but they still have road wins. Again, we're calling Ohio State a tournament team, so it changes a lot of these profiles. They've won at Ohio State. They've won at Penn State, which still matters, a top 60, 65 road win. And, because they've got some road damage already in the vault, the Hoosiers remain a win. They're playing Purdue tonight. If they win that, they're in. So it's like they're a win away. With BYU, like Brad summed them up almost the exact same way I would have. They're 291 in non-conference scheduling. That's brutal for the bubble. Their best road win is at Colorado. That's somewhat helpful, but they got to get something against the field and keep building on those wins they got at home against Baylor and ASU. Wake Forest covered very well. But I would also add that the ACC picture is getting really interesting because SMU is just a team that needs something against anybody in the field, but they haven't done any bad. They're 10-5 in meaningful games, which if you just looked at that, they're in. But unfortunately, none of those 10 teams they beat are tournament quality. Now you got a Stanford team who's on the rise. They just won at North Carolina. Kyle Smith's an incredible coach. And they're in this weird coast-to-coast league where they're on the road all the time. Well, they got a real chance against SMU tomorrow. And I think the winner of that, no matter who wins it, is going to be at least a little more interesting. And then Stanford, once again, they turn around and get to host Wake Forest next Wednesday. So they can completely start to flip the script. They got that road UNC win under their belt. They're just dealing with a crazy home loss to Cal Poly, which is a whole other can of worms. But I think the entire ACC bubble, when you look at Wake Forest, SMU, Stanford on the outside, and then Pittsburgh on the inside, and potentially other teams, and North Carolina on the outside, there's still a lot of scenarios in this league.
So I was going to bring up the North Carolina and SMU question, and that's why you're the expert here on the show, because you took that right out of my mouth. So we went right to North Carolina and SMU. So we talked about that, and the last thing that I want to get to here is the Big East. Now, last year, we saw the Big East had 3 teams. They got 3 teams into the tournament. This year, I think you can feel pretty confident about 4 teams: Connecticut, Marquette, St. John's, and Creighton. You feel pretty good about 4 teams. Now, obviously, there could be some slippage there, down the stretch. But right now, you feel pretty good about the Big East getting 4 teams in. And besides those top 4 teams, there would be 2 teams right now on the outside looking in that could potentially play their way into the field. And I think there's a little separation between the two. And those 2 teams would be Xavier and Villanova. Villanova has definitely come back to earth here in the month of January, where in the early part of January, maybe there was some potential for Villanova. Now they've started to accumulate losses, and it's really hard to see them playing their way back into the field. I don't want to totally close the book on Villanova yet, but it might already be closed. My question there would be Xavier, which in a lot of brackets finds themselves in that first 4 out, next 4 out kind of conversation. Brad and Rocco, Brad, I can start with you here. What does Xavier need to do down the stretch here to find themselves in with 9 games remaining?
Yeah, so first of all, you take a look at their resume. I mean, what stands out? They won at Marquette, which is huge. And I think that kind of sets them up well. They're actually in one of my first four out teams at the moment. So, of course, you take a look at the rest of their schedule. You got to beat the teams you're supposed to beat. You got Georgetown, you got Villanova, you got Providence, DePaul, Butler, Seton Hall. I mean, look at this schedule. This has got to be one of the easier schedules of any bubble team the rest of the way. So you can't afford slip ups, though. That's the problem. They're just 1-7 against quad one opponents, and just 6-9 against quad 1 and 2. They have avoided the bad losses so far, but it's very interesting. They beat Marquette on the road. They beat UConn. They beat Wake Forest, another bubble team. Beat Villanova, but I don't see Villanova getting back in the mix at this rate. Their metrics are brutal right now. But look, you got to take care of business. I would say the toughest game left on their schedule is probably at Villanova. But this is a team that needs to finish strong. You need to go out and let's say win, 9 of their last 10 games. If you're an NCAA tournament team, you got to beat these teams.
That was my question to you, Rocco. With Xavier having 9 games remaining, just one of them is quad 1. Is that a situation where Xavier needs to go at least 8-1 or 9-0 to get in? Or because if you get to that 7-2 number, then what are those 2 losses they could afford? Is it an 8-win or 9-win thing, or are they still in the conversation at 7-2?
Yeah, I think 7-2, they actually get a little interesting. I think to me, the wins at the top are good for the bubble. Like, I know it's only 2 wins, but it's home UConn and at Marquette. I think right now the biggest problem is the high-end win percentage. In the bubble, one of the things that certain committee members will do, and we have it on our team sheets, is you cut the quad 2 in half. So you have 2A and 2B. And all 11 of Xavier's hardest games are listed in the top 2A, and they're 2-9. So, out of these last 9 games, I feel like half of them, maybe more than half, will get into that bucket. And that can at least start to balance things out. But right now, in meaningful games overall, they're just 6-9. So yeah, a 7-2 finish, as long as they're all meaningful, well, that gets you to 13-11, and we can actually, by those basic grounds, we can select Xavier. And you mix in some road wins. Right now, there are road wins that really qualify for anything, or of course Marquette. But then DePaul keeps sneaking in and out of quad 2 and 3. Certainly don't want to depend on that meaning much. But I think there is a world where they could go 7-2 and find themselves in, because their schedule's decent. It's 143, but there's a lot of bad ones out there. Northwestern is 312. North Carolina's got a really good one, but obviously BYU's bad. Xavier's schedule was harder than Nebraska and Indiana. So again, they're in that top 150 schedule range. The Big East needs somebody to kind of assume that 5th spot. They're the best candidate, and I think with that remaining schedule, it's doable.
All right, let's wrap this up here real quickly with some games to watch this weekend. It is a loaded Saturday slate tomorrow. But as far as the bracket goes, what are some games you guys are keeping an eye on? Brad, we'll start with you.
Yep. So in terms of the bubble, which is kind of like how I like to do it, but I've listed a ton of games. In terms of the bubble, BYU at UCF is one game to keep an eye on. Obviously, UCF is in one of our last 4 teams in. BYU is one of our first 4 teams out. Pitt at Wake Forest, as we mentioned earlier. Arizona State, for Arizona State to kind of hold steady and move up that last 4 in. They were my last team in the field. They could really use that win against a team like Arizona's been playing extremely well. And I'll give you one more. I'm going to say, if you take a look at Georgia, Alabama, look, Ole Miss won at Alabama. If Georgia can go win at Alabama, it changes the entire complexion of their resume. And it puts them from a team that is right on the bubble to a team that should be in the NCAA tournament.
Rocco, your games to watch this weekend.
Well, hey, follow me all day tomorrow, because it's going to be an amazing day in the desert. It starts early, very early, a nationally televised big one. The rivals, Arizona State, one of the last teams in the field. hosting Arizona and what I assume and I really hope is an unbelievable environment. The curtain of distraction during Arizona free throws, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be electric in there. And then at night, you got Grand Canyon. Already know about how crazy that atmosphere is. Hosting first place Utah Valley. The state of Arizona only has 4 Division I schools. Tomorrow is the day in the state of Arizona for a doubleheader. So it has to start with those two. But I think outside of that, Ole Miss has an opportunity for a court storming, playing Auburn at home, and really secure a spot in that top 4 that we were debating all show long today. You have Baylor, who I mentioned is now flirting with the bubble. Well, they can kind of reassure themselves and their fans by beating Kansas at home tomorrow. That will be a big opportunity for the Bears. Florida destroyed Tennessee by 30 the last time they played in Gainesville. Tomorrow's the rematch in Knoxville. One of the things they did there was completely take Chaz Lanier out of the game, and I can't wait to see how Rick Barnes and company adjust. I think it's a size problem on the guard and wing positions. So if Florida dominates that matchup like they did last time, they will have a strong case to start looking at a 1 seed, the Gators. So that's obviously interesting. And then you have Gonzaga going to St. Mary's, the big one here locally in the Bay Area. St. Mary's is playing extremely well. Gonzaga had a week off last week, and I think they figured out some of their flaws. They steamrolled Oregon State on Tuesday. We got both these teams on a crescendo. It's gonna be a phenomenal matchup late tomorrow night, 11 p.m. Eastern. So just a handful of some awesome basketball that we'll see all day long tomorrow.
All right, fellas, this was a great show this afternoon. Thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks to Dagan and Trevor for putting that bracket together. I'm Paul Fritschner. That's Rocco Miller and Brad Wachtel. Make sure to follow us on everything as we keep going, and everybody will keep you updated on bracketology moving forward. But this was the first full bracket reveal on Fielding the 68. We'll have plenty more throughout the month of February and then into March, so stay tuned for that. Signing off for now. Enjoy your weekend, everybody, on a great weekend of college basketball. This has been Fielding the 68, presented by Rhythm. We'll see you next time right here on the Field of 68.